Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is Chapter 34 of Gunnerkrigg Court, Faraway Morning and Three Short Tales. And this was a fun chapter for me to work on because I wanted to bring back a lot of the background characters and have a chapter where they were all hanging out together and Annie and Kat actually got to spend some time with other characters in the story. And that's something you don't really see very often in the comic. Because from the start I'd always intended it to be kind of a solitary place to live, where the characters seem to spend a lot of time alone and maybe only have a very small circle of friends, in the case of Annie and Kat. And I sort of liked the feeling of, while living an essentially solitary life in the court, it was nice to get together with small groups of people and meet up in secret and hide away. And that's really why I sort of staged this chapter as if it was a kind of breakout or escape to some late night speakeasy. And another thing I wanted to do with this chapter was use some of the old ideas that I'd originally had for the comic that eventually ended up being rejected storylines, and in thinking of ways to reuse them without slotting them into the main plot. And I came up with the idea of incorporating 3 shorter stories into this longer chapter. And since it is a relatively long chapter with a lot of stuff going on, I won't obsess over too many of the finer details, but I'll just sort of talk about some of the relationships I wanted to show and some of the stuff that I guess is going on in the chapter. And it kind of starts out similar to when the kids last broke out of their dorms in the power station chapter, where Kat is kind of asked along because she can help out with the robots, but at this point in the story, the characters are a bit older now, and some of them might have some ulterior motives for wanting to break out and hang out with the boys after dark. They aren't escaping out to see some cool science experiment this time. They're literally breaking out just to hang out with some friends. And when they do arrive and meet with the other boys, I get to show one of the most hated schoolyard couples, which is to say the couple that is in a relationship and they're comfortable and open with each other and don't really mind that anyone else knows that they're together, which is basically the exact opposite of what William and Janet are at this point. And so throughout this chapter, Margot and John act the most coupley, and we get our introduction to Bud, who was a character that I really enjoyed writing, and we get to catch up a bit with Jack as well. And we see that he's kind of changed from his experiences with Zimmy and the stuff that happened in some previous chapters. And now once they're all settled down, we get into the first short story, being told by Margot and John. And this was actually one of the first rejected storylines that I had from back when I was originally planning the comic. Originally, Annie would have been in Margot's place here. Not that she and John were supposed to be a couple, but originally the comic was going to be more a collection of sort of strange occurrences and maybe ghost stories, that kind of thing. And in the storyline that I eventually decided not to do, Annie and John would have somehow come across this cursed instrument and had these ghosts attached to them, as is what happens to John and Margot here. And the chapter would have been about them figuring out what they needed to do to get rid of the ghosts. Ultimately, I felt that there wouldn't have been much point to the chapter outside of the very bare-bones concept that's presented here, which could be wrapped up in 3 pages. And the tone of the comic kind of moved away from what I was thinking of back then. But I still liked the character of John, and I wanted an opportunity to draw some more traditional ghosts. So I figured I'd illustrate that short idea here between him and Margot. I guess another reason I decided not to have this short storyline in the comic is because I felt that it might have set up John and Annie as if they were fated to be romantic interests for each other. And in the end I decided that's not really something I wanted to explore in the comic or really have set up if I wasn't going to follow through on it. But even at this early planning stage, you can kind of see that a long-running theme of the comic is about looking past how scary and weird something is and understanding the story behind a creature like a ghost or a minotaur or a tree wolf. And so after that, we check back in with all the kids and catch up again with Annie and Jack. And we also see that everybody is sort of paired off and talking amongst themselves. Even though Kat's paired off with Bud and she's just talking about nerdy things with him. And that's something I'll touch on a little bit later. And then we sort of focus on Path and how she's acting towards Matt and his reactions to her. And I kind of wanted to show a situation where a girl was showing an interest in a guy, but the guy's obviously just not that into it for seemingly no real reason. So Winsbury, seemingly heavy-handed, gets Matt to spill the beans. And this leads us into the second of 3 stories, which wasn't a rejected storyline, but it was a chance for me to do something in the comic that I felt that I'd moved away from since the very beginning. And that was to examine a story or a myth or a creature that I found interesting, just for the sake of having something fun to write and draw in the comic. And the only time I'd really done that was back in Chapter 2 with the Minotaur, Basil, where they come across a mythical creature, they converse for a bit, hear his story, and then that's basically the end of that. And that was kind of indicative of how I felt the comic was originally going to be laid out, and of course it was something that I moved away from. And so I chose just a small scenario that could be wrapped up in a few pages, where Matt gets to meet and interact with Chang-E and her rabbit. And in a similar way to Kat's chapter with Ali, I just wanted to show a small situation where 2 people get to hang out and never see each other again, but they have a lasting impression on each other. And that brings us back to the regular world, where we see that the reason why Matt isn't particularly into Path right now is simply because he's just pining for someone else. And I was interested in this scenario because it's a scenario where nobody had done anything wrong. And in fact, the only person who could be seen to have done something wrong was Winsbury, in calling out the fact that Matt was pining for somebody else. And everybody else has to sort of sit by and watch Path go down in flames. But as he points out at the end of this page, him bringing up the truth just managed to diffuse the situation before anybody got in over their head. And I did this as a small indication of how Winsbury's personality has kind of changed, and the background development of him as a character. And this brings me back to what I wanted to mention about Kat. If you notice, everybody else in the chapter is kind of dressed up for the occasion of breaking out at night and hanging out. Everybody except Kat, who happens to have turned up in just a dark sweater and dark trousers, because the last time that they broke out of their dorms, they were doing so secret style, not wanting to get caught. Even Annie, who is not particularly socially aware, manages to wear an outfit that is themed a bit closer to the feel that I wanted for this chapter. But Kat, turning up in a boring old outfit and being lumped with Bud talking about torque motors and semiconductors, she's kind of the odd one out in this situation, in a way almost at a loss as to what she should be doing. She might have even found it more interesting if they'd broken out to go and see some cool nighttime activity or a late night experiment the court was conducting. And I wanted to show this because while Kat is very outgoing, especially compared to Annie, at this stage in her life she's not particularly self-aware. And right now Kat is somebody who very much wears her heart on her sleeve and says things that, while they're completely earnest and sincere, might seem a little too forthcoming to somebody and give the wrong impression, which is what leads to this little mix-up here, which will be expounded upon later on. I guess I was interested in this kind of thing because there is a moment where, I can imagine for a lot of people there's a time where, in growing up, you start to feel a lot more self-conscious about yourself, or you are forced to start realizing that the way that you come across to other people might be something that you've not given too much thought, and then one day before you realize it, the friends and the people around you have grown up a little bit and started thinking about different things. So this was just a small situation that gives Kat a bit of a wake-up call, though what we actually see in the next chapter leads her to being a little bit too self-conscious about herself. And so after that we're back with Annie and Jack. And the main thing here is, as Jack mentions, that Annie seems to be acting a bit differently since she came back from the forest. Unfortunately, she's being a bit mean and vindictive here, something which Jack calls her out for. But it kind of boils down to Annie just not really knowing what she's doing or really why she does some of the things she does. And this is a long-running point that goes throughout and is explored later on in the story. And then we head back to the other characters who are still chatting away and messing around, and this leads into Winsbury and Janet's story, which is kind of the most obvious one since the reader already knows that the two of them are secretly hiding their relationship. But I kind of wanted to show this short story because it really illustrates how different the two of them are. Winsbury being a very typical modern boy and finding things like powerful cars and street races and kind of a cool, dangerous lifestyle, and Janet being more traditional, thinking in terms of romantic novellas and trashy love stories. But despite that, the two of them work great together, and that's something I try to illustrate a lot of in the comic. The two of them just make up this dumb story on the spot, playing off each other's ideas, and they complement each other in kind of a weird way, which I enjoy, and allows them to, once again, keep their relationship a secret. And I suppose that really is the theme for this chapter, even this small section here where Jack is talking about Zimmy, and then Annie talks briefly about Asengren and how he deals with his emotions and relationships. So while the chapter isn't full of a ton of action, it's one of my favourite ones because it gave me a chance to show these characters all interacting with each other and developing their personality a bit more. It was nice to see Annie and Kat interacting with other people in their class. And I wanted to sort of give the impression that these are people that they know during their day-to-day lives at school. And they're also people that live in the court and have their own stories and development that go on in the background. It's given Annie and Kat a few things to think about and a bit of development that happens separate from each other. And then, of course, the chapter ends with another example of a relationship between Bud and Lindsay, who are a long-time old married couple, in a way that I thought was kind of a fun way to end off the chapter. And then we have a super lame bonus page, and that's that. Come back again for chapter 35. Parley and Smitty are in this one.